We are live now. Welcome everybody to Side Dish, brought to you by the Iowa Food System Coalition. This is the live podcast edition to our podcast at the Iowa Farm Table, which I hope that you are all subscribing and sharing with your friends, whether it be on Substack or your other favorite platforms. We are joined today with by Ilsa DeWald, who is, uh, make sure I get your title correct. You are the local foods coordinator for Johnson County.
So that was my previous title, and now I'm the local food and farm manager.
All right,
Um,
wonderful. And so Ilsa is really involved with the coalition. You serve on our steering committee, as well as one of the co-chairs of the policy, local food policy team, which is doing really exciting work. But today we're going to talk about a little bit about the roles and of what local food policy councils um, are doing in Iowa, and particularly in Johnson County, as well as just what the scope of what you're able to do in your role in Johnson County. And so, I want to first take it off to you. What do you find? First of all, what's the basics? What is a local food policy council for people not sure?
yeah, so I think there's many different ways that a local food policy council or coalition can look. One of the ways that I think about them looking is a group of volunteers who represent or are involved with different sectors of the food system. So whether that be production, thinking about farmers, or whether it be retail, grocery stores or farmers market managers, or processing, cooking, chefs, and then also larger scale institutional processing, canning, freezing, distributing, and distribution to members of the community who are driving trucks to deliver food, or waste management, thinking about compost as well, and land stewardship. So, all of those different roles in the food system. And so, a group of people gathering to talk about and discuss issues in the community and how we can address barriers and challenges and provide opportunities to improve and strengthen our food system. And sometimes these groups have more, I think that there is such a power and an opportunity for different representation from different areas of this food system to get together. Sometimes they're more congregated around certain issues. So, food access is a big one of why people start meeting and trying to figure out to solve the problem of why are, some members of our community not able to access the type or quantity of food that they need and want. And it can grow from there to be able to address needs in the food system and, like I said, overcome those barriers.
Excellent. Now, these councils can exist in a wide variety of being relatively informal to being more formalized councils that are embedded within local government. In Johnson County, I believe the local food policy council is a part of the county government. Can you describe, maybe talk about how that came about and um, some of the benefits and of maybe both models?
Yeah, definitely. So, in Johnson and Lynn County, actually, the councils came about the same time in 2012, and that really came from actually like a multi-county citizen, resident group that was really interested in convening to talk about where our food comes from and trying to create more sustainable and resilient food systems. And so, it was really through that community grassroots effort, bringing it to the attention of local governments and saying, hey, this is part of it is also looking at best practices that other communities are doing, and food policy councils were popping up more across the country as methods and as containers to have those discussions. And so, community members brought that to the Board of Supervisors level in both Johnson and Lynn counties. And then the board, through a resolution process, created councils as advisory bodies in each of those counties. And so the board supervisors, as elected officials, appoint the volunteers that are a part of each of those councils. And so for Johnson County, we have 15 members of the community who are all volunteer, who are appointed by the board. and are use their lived experience and perspectives and bring that to add to discussion on issues related to food and agriculture. And so there is, I think, a lot of value in having a council that's specifically appointed by the board. It just provides a nice, I often think of it as a bridge between county government, between a local government and the community. We still work with a lot of nonprofits and other groups that are outside of the county structure, but then also kind of has this platform where it allows community members to learn more about what's going on in local government. Honestly, before I was employed as a for my job in the county, I didn't know a terribly large amount of what the county did day in and day out. And so I think it's a learning opportunity. And yeah, there is value in my position. I serve as a staff liaison for the council and have for the 7 years that I've been with the county now. And part of that is helping facilitate and helping guide the understanding of how does county government work? What are the levers that can be changed to help move towards the vision of the food system we want to see, and then to provide that information to the council members for discussion. And so I think, and also just even having knowing more intimately how things work provides that perspective, and then being more in the mix when opportunities come up is a really valuable thing. So, for example, in Johnson County, when the county received their American Rescue Plan Act funds, there was funding, an opportunity for COVID response. And we had already been talking about as a council on trying to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the food system. And so we were already positioned to be able to have that conversation with community members and then to create a recommendation to bring to the board on opportunities to utilize those funds. And that led to the creation of the Community Food and Farm Grant, in which food and farm businesses were able to apply for funding to help make their businesses more resilient because of what we saw, so often in COVID, of when the global food supply chains are just these very long, very fragile supply chains are broken or face disruptions, then there's real impacts for the food supply in our area. So part of our resiliency response was to be able to hopefully strengthen our local food production and supply chains. So yeah, I think it was really unique that we were ready, had the information about those funding opportunities being available, and were able to gather input, use the knowledge and wisdom and history and experience of the council that had been already around for over a decade at that point, and be able to launch a recommendation.
No, that's a really powerful example of the fact that you were already at the table, so to speak, meant that when this kind of once in a generation opportunity came across for local governments, that you were ready and able to seize on that opportunity in a really powerful and meaningful way. As a county supervisor myself, I'm really curious about some of the ways both you in your role as a staff person, but also how the council has interacted with maybe other departments across the county and been able to help collaborate or inform decision making. That's a really fascinating thing to me.
Yeah, because I think that, too, having an advisory body that's specifically focused on food and agriculture, just allows that specific lens to come through. And because the county is working on so many different things, there's roads and a lot of the work that we do has intersected too with the planning department. So a lot of the early initiatives of the Food Policy Council were around zoning policies and opportunities to remove barriers for smaller scale businesses. And there were some specific policy levers that were identified and policies that were needed to be updated. And so having the council, and especially like as my role too is in the board office of the county. And so it allows me to have more I think a space and a position to be really collaborative with all the departments. So with planning, our planning development sustainability office, I was able to gather input from the Food Policy Council, from other stakeholders in the community in our food system, and advise on policy language that was being drafted by that planning department and presented to the board. And so as they do, not always staff recommendations don't always align exactly. And so there was able to be some really robust discussion and both among staff and with the board and with the council. And so oftentimes too, it would even work like the Food Policy Council would have a recommendation. I would have a recommendation as a staff person. The planning department would have their recommendation, and all of that information would go to the board to be able to make their decision. Um, and I think that we're still looking at, that was a partnership and information share with the planning department. I think we're working on collaborating more with public health, of having, they have food security goals, and are trying to understand and analyze like what is happening in our communities and how can we better respond. And we're trying to work with them to do some data mapping and food system asset mapping across our county. I feel like we're, I think that honestly, the Food Policy Council works collaboratively in like my role to across most departments in the county.
No, that's really exciting and powerful. I think about um, county zoning ordinances, across the state. The vast majority of it is written from the perspective of the needs for commodity crops, but not so much table food production. So having that example where having those voices at the table meant that we're going beyond just traditional agricultural needs in the state to what we need for localized table food production is really exciting, and I think something that um, the coalition is interested in modeling across the state. 'Cause I think I get excited when I think about the zoning possibilities of what we could accomplish for, as you said, making that space, that carve out for smaller scale agriculture that's so often overlooked in outdated policies across the state. So that's really great. Tell me about the Johnson County Poor Farm. And what Iowa had this rich history of these port farms that existed for bad and good across the state. But Johnson County has really been able to turn that asset that they held onto into something truly remarkable today.
Yeah. So again, another shining example of like community grassroots efforts bringing about something, really wonderful and powerful. And so I think that, yeah, a lot of what I think about when working within the county and working within community, leveraging not only policy, but also like what infrastructure is there that is existing, that is publicly owned, and how can we utilize it to support public access to food, and or, being able to improve the resiliency of the food system. And so the grassroots effort really came from a food pantry in our area, a lot of which, many food pantries, in particular, Coralville Community Food Pantry Director John Bowler was recognizing the need for local produce or like fresh produce in pantries, that there just wasn't a huge supply available. There wasn't, um, you know, it just was a really big need, and began looking at opportunities for public land and how can we potentially utilize public land that's available to grow food for the community. And and so that's what really launched, and honestly making an inquiry and being like, "Hey, county, like, is this a possibility that we could utilize some of the publicly owned land to start a project that's gonna grow produce for the community and, for community pantries, not only Corrival, but for, like, pantries across the county." And that really launched what became a 10-year planning process, eventually, after many conversations. That's like you always simplify the story. There's always
Yes.
and nuances. But really, from that inquiry, we launched a 10-year planning process in bringing into not only recognizing like, oh, we could have this project that's growing food directly for pantries and also be renting out the land instead of just to one row crop farmer for a for a land rent check, how could we use this to potentially incubate, to start to help many farm businesses and areas of the food system grow? And so in 2017, the board adopted a 10-year revitalization and vision for the site that not only included, and I think was grounded first and foremost in preserving the history. So they intentionally chose to keep the name historic, Poor Farm, to really reckon with the fact that, the Poor Farm has been owned by the counties, that land since 1855 and operated for over 100 years as a social service site that has a really complex history of both being seen as, the modern day social service. Many, most counties across the state, I think if not all of them, had poor farms of some type. And it was basically a publicly owned housing space that was also an active farm. And so there's a nuance there of people who were living there were able to potentially gain farming skills, utilize skills that they already had, and also were not, were provided room and board, but were not necessarily compensated for that labor if they were staying there. And there were paid employees uh, on poor farms across the state, and also there were people who were working for room and board. And so, I think through many decisions, Johnson County had still an intact 160 acres of land and historic barns and buildings. Not some of the buildings had been, replaced or um, are not all super original, but we do have many barns. We have a 1912 dairy barn. And so part of that plan was preserving those buildings, being able to use them as interpretive history sites, and also being able to bring the land and bring the space into a functional space for the community. So being able to allow our land access program for growers who are growing their small businesses for direct to consumer markets, whether it's selling at farmers market or CSA or to restaurants. Or we have one farmer who is growing a bunch of habanero peppers to make into hot sauce, and then also we have a partnership with a couple nonprofits. So Global Food Project that started community gardens that center the needs of our, recent immigrant and refugee populations, many of whom wanted access to land to be able to grow crops that they were used to eating and didn't have as much access to here, and or just have it be a grounding place of like how to get to know other community members, how to feel connected to the community. And then Iowa Valley RC&D operates what became the Grow Johnson County program, which was part of that initial community effort to not only provide fresh produce to pantries, but also beginning farmer education. And so through all of this too, we have a collaborative effort with the Historical Society. We collaborate with the county conservation and other environmental groups to really make this not only now the 10-year plan was really infused with this idea of new century farm. So how are we creating partnerships for the community and leveraging those existing community resources to help share, expand opportunities for beginning businesses, farmers, and to increase access to food, education, and enjoyment of the site. So there's also natural areas that we're revitalizing and trying to make more publicly accessible, as well as like honoring those spaces that there are on site, like an unmarked cemetery. We have that space that now we are working to commemorate and to interpret with signage, and to make accessible for people to reflect and to know about.
Oh, what a fascinating space, and it's for folks that haven't been out there. It's beautiful. Whether you're in the big red barn or just out looking at the fields or in the prairies that are being restored. I believe there's an oak savanna under restoration, if I remember correctly. Um, and so that's just really a really powerful example of how local government can play a role in this critical question of land and resource access, and the power behind that. I believe that there's also been some processing capabilities added to the farm too, and that's a critical infrastructure need that we're trying to meet in the state of Iowa. So to have all of that under one, so-called roof in one location is really remarkable. Um, before I let you go today, Ilsa, what um excites you right now about food in Iowa?
Ooh, what excites me right now? I think that, that we have had so much like, so I've been involved in food system work for now 10 plus years, which seems like such a short time, and also starting to feel like, some amount of time in the biz, but I have been so excited to see the amount of infrastructure, not only like physical infrastructure that we're able to rebuild within our food system, so figuring out how do we operate food hubs, how do we add more cooler space on farms? How do we, create those physical infrastructure pieces, processing kitchens, shared use kitchens, like the one that's going in at the historic poor farm, and also though the social infrastructure. So recognizing that behind any of those pieces of equipment, any tractor is a person who knows how to use it. And I think that that's something that we are starting to create and recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, and that we can figure out how to compensate people for that labor and hopefully develop those skills and not just see, um, a drain out of the state of Iowa of people with that food system knowledge. So working to actually like increase the amount of knowledge that's here, and be able to continue working together. And so I think that that's really, what I feel all the time being able to work with the Iowa Food System Coalition is a space where we can get together and collaboratively discuss what is the best way to support our community, and how do we work together with what we have, to really enact that. And so I think that, it really leaning into the networking and community building opportunities like I feel within the coalition and have always felt too on that local level within the Food Policy Council. So I think that, uh, and also I'll just say that the energy is still high there. We just had our annual round of applications, and we had a record number of applications for the Food Policy Council. There was, 7 seats and over 20 applicants, and it's for a volunteer, a volunteer job, a volunteer role. And so I'm just really always blown away by people's willingness and interest to be able to step up and figure out how to support the community.
That's a really great measure of the excitement. Oftentimes various county boards, you're struggling to get applicants sometimes, and so to have that much demand just shows that the community is recognizing how transformational and powerful the work that's being done is. And so, my hats off to you. Congratulations on just everything you've got going on in Johnson County. It's really inspiring that we can mimic and replicate across the state. And so, I want to thank you, Ilsa, for being here with us today for Side Dish Live, and I want to thank those of you tuning in, whether it's live or later on, and remind you to all come back next week for our next episode of At the Iowa Farm Table. This is Chris Schwartz with the Iowa Food System Coalition. We've been joined today by Ilsa DeWald from Johnson County. Thank you all, and thank you, Ilsa.
Thank you, Chris. Have a good one.
You too.